Hi, welcome to the Blind Eternities Tavern. I'm the Brewmaster. You know, I've been building decks for over 20 years, but it sure has changed a lot. Back before TCG Player, before Card Kingdom, back when we had to find our own cards, uphill, in the snow, both ways. I want to talk about how things used to be, and how we can use those same principles to build decks today. If that sounds interesting to you, pull up a chair, have a seat at the table, and whether you're a button mash hack and slash controller bash, or a meeple moving mastermind of maps, mats, and minis, if you ruffle at the awful riffle shuffle scuffle, or if you're a click clack, pick attack, number ball, luck sack, we're all here for the same reason. I'm Jake. Let's talk games. I don't know if you can hear it. The storm's rolling in. This story, though, comes from a time before storm. Time back when combo decks were clunky, inconsistent, and tough to build. And I don't know if you know this about me, but I live for combo decks. I love it. I think one of my first exposures to real competitive Magic, and reading about it more than playing about it, was an old article written by, I believe, Aaron Forsyth, probably 2002, 2003 era. And it was titled Decks with Horsepower. And that collection of weird, esoteric combo decks really lit up something in my brain about what potential Magic the Gathering had. And one deck in particular struck my interest. That deck being a deck built in Mirage time frame, and the deck went by the name Prose Bloom. In fact, I came across this recently, but I have a piece of paper that I printed of the deck list that I got from the article. And this is how it was done. You know, it was really hard to find cards. You kind of had to open them or trade them. Stores had very limited stock, and there was no real online marketplace. But something that I find really interesting about this is more than just the cards listed there. Next to each one, I have cards that I wanted to use instead, upgrades, in my mind. I don't know that they were necessarily upgrades, but it's a combination of what I had, what I could get access to, and things that I thought fit that slot. Other things, like Elven Cash next to it, I have Improve Yawgmoth's Will, right? I had some upgrades in mind. I also had dollar values next to this. Natural Balance, $2. Power Sink, $1.50. Squandered Resources, $2. My favorite, though, is Vampiric Tutor, $5. That's right, $5. With a question mark, because that's expensive. So I went through the trouble of tracking down all of these cards. Before I did that, though, my main deck was my Elf deck. Again, that was my favorite casual deck. Actually, we can pull that up. Now, this has been cannibalized for a few different EDH decks and a Legacy Elf deck that uses a lot of the same pieces. But one of the things that I was incredibly proud of was these copies of Coat of Arms. 7th edition had just come out, and so I had actually gotten a copy of Coat of Arms. But I was not a fan of the white border, and so that card found a home in my brother's zombie deck. I wanted to get my own playset of original Exodus Coat of Arms. And that became quite the chore. It was an adventure. I tried to find it at every local game store around me. I think I picked up a couple of them. I was able to get in contact with a friend of a friend that had one, traded for that. And the fourth one, I actually bought while I was on vacation. We were visiting family in Colorado, and as we were driving down the street, I saw a card shop and begged my parents to stop. I said, I just wanted to check one thing. And so we pulled over, we went into the shop, and I asked if they had coat of arms. And they pulled out a little plastic tray with the stuff, and they had one of the old original printings of coat of arms. And they were selling it for $14. And that was so exciting, because I finally completed the playset. So when I started building Prose Bloom, I expected it to be a similar adventure. But it turns out I was able to find a few people that had played the deck back in the day and had most of the parts that I needed. So I was able to get the pieces fairly cheap, much cheaper than you'd be able to today. A lot of it's on the reserve list, but putting that deck together and playing it was super fun. It did all sorts of weird things. The main combo being using Prosperity to make both players draw a bunch of cards, and you're drawing into more gas for your combo, and they're drawing into more cards that they can't use until they start their turn. So as long as you win on that turn, your opponent never gets to use any of those cards. It actually reminds me of a different deck. Came out around 2005 when Ravnica released, with a neat little ability called Transmute that allows you to discard a card and tutor for any card in your entire deck that has the same converted mana cost. It's restrictive, but it turns out there's a lot of really good stuff at 2 and 3 mana. So what you would do is transmute for tutors. Transmute for things like Mist of Phantasms, which you can then transmute for things like Heartbeat of Spring to produce extra mana. And a combination between Heartbeat of Spring and a couple ways to untap your lands, and you're rolling. Tons of mana. The deck closes by producing over 23 mana and playing Maga Trader to Mortals, which drains your opponent for X. That was a really fun deck to play as well, and it performed great. At that point, I was playing competitive Standard, and I remember one particular Friday Night Magic when I played very well, I would say, in round 2 or 3 of the tournament, and it was not even close. Completely blew out my opponent. And it was a lucky draw. That happens with a combo deck. But my opponent went on a tirade, talking about how net decking is the most poisonous, awful thing to happen to Magic, and how people that build their decks just by pulling lists online ruin the game for everybody. He said that this game, Magic the Gathering, was dead. Nobody's going to play it anymore. And then he just quit the tournament, left in the middle of Friday Night Magic. And it's funny because I think that was really the time in which the winds were changing. You look at the way we build decks now, so many people build a deck online first and then go and find the cards that they need. Very top-down deck construction, which is not necessarily a problem. I think that's great. But I wanted to make a deck that kind of blends those two decks together. Clunky, old, and explosive. So I did that. This is my version of the Prose Bloom deck. Uses Heartbeat of Spring to power out mana, and it uses all of the old classics. The big difference is that now you close out the game with a Tendrils of Agony, because you need something that you can feed all of that mana into. And the way we do that is Sensei's Divining Top. See, because Sensei's Divining Top has a neat little ability that allows you to tap it to draw a card and put Sensei's Divining Top on top of your deck. Which means, if you have 2 of them, well, each mana you spend is another spell you've cast, is another copy of Tendrils of Agony. It works great. Alright, let's walk through what this deck does and what we're trying to accomplish. First off, Tendrils of Agony is our win condition. Our goal is to play a bunch of spells and then play Tendrils of Agony. And that's it. The way we do that is by powering out mana. The first card that powers out mana is Squandered Resources. This allows us to sacrifice lands to make mana. Right now I'm running 3 copies of it. The second is Cadaverous Bloom. This allows you to discard cards to make mana. That's really important. Also running 3 copies. Next, we have Natural Balance, which allows everybody to search or sacrifice until they have 5 lands in play. You can see a nice little combo here, where we can sacrifice all of our lands to make mana and use that mana to play Natural Balance to search for more lands. Or we can discard 2 cards from our hand to make mana and use that mana to search until we have 5 lands in play, and then sacrifice them to Squandered Resources. Our entire deck is using basic lands, so everything comes into play untapped. We always have things to search for with a Natural Balance. The only risk here is that you are giving your opponent more mana, but we have a lot of cards that do that. So now you might be wondering why we're only playing 3 of each of these instead of 4. Like I said, it's a little clunky. They are high mana cost, even with everything else we're doing in the deck. The big breakpoints are going to be 2 mana, 4 mana, and 5 mana. Once we have our engine running with some combination of these cards, then we start drawing cards. And we do that using Prosperity. Prosperity is a blue and X. All players draw X cards. There are ways of playing through a game that allows you to play Prosperity enough times to deck out your opponent without decking out yourself. That doesn't happen very often, but it is a backup win condition. So if somehow they deal with Tendrils of Agony, we're on the deck out game plan. Now we come to cards that allow us to get to our engine, our win condition, and our draw power. That's going to be Sylvan Library, to rearrange the top cards of our deck or draw extra cards. Lim-Dûl's Vault, which allows us to rearrange the top 5 cards in our deck, but we can do it a number of times. So usually, you'll be repeating Lim-Dûl's Vault 5 or 6 times, paying a bunch of life, but you can stack the top 5 cards of your deck. And so you're looking for combinations of cards, like I said, there's an engine here, that get to what you need, where you can stack a Prosperity with other things underneath it to allow you to keep going. Next up, we have Infernal Contract. This is in the original deck. I'm not sold on it. I'm keeping it there for posterity and because I think it's a kind of cool card. But basically, it's 3 mana to draw 4, and you lose half your life. We don't care about life so much as long as we don't go into the negatives. Fun note, in the original deck, you could go into the negatives. Magic rules were weird, but they've changed that. So now, you got to be a little more conscious of your health at every point. But this is still a good card. If you have a Cadaverous Bloom in play, it is discard 2 cards, draw 4. Next, I have a Feldon's Cane. This is one of the cards that allows us to deck people. You can reshuffle your graveyard into your library by sacrificing this. So it gives you not quite an infinite library because this does exile itself, but it lets you keep going and have about twice as many cards as your opponent. Okay. That's the original core of the deck. So now we're looking at new stuff that helps support that. And I'm not saying this is the best build of the deck. Again, I was restricting myself to only using pieces that were in the original Prose Bloom deck or in the more modern Heartbeat of Spring combo deck from Kamigawa Ravnica block. And even then, there's a few things added here that aren't quite within that. Sylvan Library, I don't think, is in there. Tendrils of Agony obviously isn't. But this is where we come to a full playset for Sensei's Divining Tops. I know these are expensive now, I just happen to have them. I think they're really versatile, they work great in this, they allow you to rearrange the top card and draw extra cards, so you can Lim-Dûl's Vault with a Sensei's Divining Top in play, use that to draw the card on the top, if the top card is Prosperity, use that to draw the rest of the cards that you got with Lim-Dûl's Vault, and you can kind of start your engine going. Next up, we have a playset of Secure Tri-Builders. This is just ramp. Again, we don't always have a lot to do on turn 2. Basically just a Sylvan Library, Squandered Resources, or Secure Tri-Builder. Ideally on turn 1 we are hitting a Sensei's Divining Top, but that's not always possible. Lim-Dûl's Vault is usually a later game card. I wouldn't cast it on turn 2 unless you have a lot of stuff that you need in your hand, because you want to draw into some cards naturally and use that to just find the remainder. Then we come into a threesome of Heartbeat of Springs. This is great. Allows us to produce extra mana. It is what it is. But typically, when we play that, we need to be on high alert. We're giving our opponents a ton of gas. So if we can do that on turn 3, hopefully they don't kill us, and then turn 4 we go off. Otherwise, it's better to wait until you can do this and something else in the same turn. If you're able to tap 3 for Heartbeat of Spring, and then sacrifice those 3 lands to squandered resources, and then use 1 additional mana to play a Natural Balance, you're off to the races. Your land's now tapped for double, and then you can sacrifice them for a 3rd mana of each color, and yeah, you win from there. We have a playset of Remands. I think this is a really solid counterspell. It draws us cards. Again, we're not trying to lock our opponent down because we're a combo deck. We just want to make them slow. So this delays any of their big spells 1 extra turn, and buying us that extra turn is usually enough to get us to go off. That's the full deck. I'm running a handful of land here, but there's nothing special. Again, we're running entirely basics. So this is 12 forests, 6 swamps, 5 islands. And that's the main deck. Typically, with casual decks, I don't bother building a sideboard, but something that I really, really liked about that deck in Kamigawa Ravnica Standard was the way the sideboard worked. It had a transformational sideboard that turned it onto kind of an aggro plan, and so that's what we're doing here. I'm running a couple of Life from the Loam, a few Vinelasher Kudzus. This is whenever you play a land, it gets +1/+1. And this allows you to bring lands back from your graveyard. And then we have a bunch of Threshold stuff that gets big. Corrosive Beast, Nimble Mongoose, and Werebear. Borrowing from a different standard block, I also played in the Odyssey, Torment, Madness era. But this allows the deck to really pivot, become a completely different animal, literally, and usually catch your opponents off guard. So if you have already beat them with the combo, you can play the same deck with some cards swapped in, usually a lot of cards swapped in, and you don't have that same loop where your opponent knows exactly what you're doing. So I really like playing this deck. I think it does some really interesting, unique things, and it has the ability to punch way above its weight class, because there are some times where you get an amazing draw, and your opponent won't necessarily have a lot of basic lands that they can search for. So when you can Natural Balance for free, you just win the game. And that's a lot of fun. So at the end of the day, I'm a combo player. I'll admit it. I like building decks that do a whole bunch of weird things in conjunction with each other that leaves your opponent bewildered, bored, and not expecting to get the turn back. And that's what this deck does. It tends to win the game after one really big turn. There's a lot more counterplay in Modern Magic, so it's a little more dicey now than it was then. And as long as you're not cheating by keeping a couple cards in your laps, as some people were known to do, it's a lot of fun to play. I encourage you to try it out and find your own Magic the Gathering classic decks that you can update for the modern era. It's been nice talking to you.